Sejam bem-vindos e bem-vindas ao Integra EAD 2020, que está discutindo o tema Educação e Tecnologias Digitais em cenários de transição, múltiplos olhares para a aprendizagem. O Integra EAD é uma realização da Secretaria Especial de Educação à Distância da Universidade Federal de Mato Grosso do Sul, Brasil. Nós estamos aqui em Campo Grande, capital do estado do Mato Grosso do Sul. Meu nome é Maria Cristina Lima Caminhado, eu sou professora do Programa de Pós-Graduação em Educação e atuo na Universidade Católica do Bosco, o CDB. Hoje nós estamos aqui para dialogar sobre Empowering Citizens to Develop Mobile Apps Towards a Creative Play Pedagogy. Então, empoderando cidadãos a desenvolver aplicativos móveis rumo a uma pedagogia de jogo criativo. E para conversar sobre esse tema, nós convidamos o professor Dick Nambi, da Universidade da Cidade do Cabo, Cape Town University. O professor Dick Nambi, ele é coordenador de pesquisa no Centro de Tecnologia Educacional da Universidade da Cidade do Cabo. Ele gerencia um projeto de aprendizagem móvel. Esse Centro de Tecnologia Educacional, ele oferece expertise em tecnologia educacional especializada na melhoria contínua da qualidade do ensino superior, por meio da ampliação do acesso, promoção da equidade, integração de tecnologias com desenvolvimento curricular e pesquisa de práticas eficazes. Seus interesses de pesquisa são gestão do conhecimento, sistemas de tutoria inteligentes, ferramentas colaborativas e aprendizagem móvel. Gostaria de lembrá-los que a palestra será em inglês. Posteriormente, nós faremos a tradução desta palestra e disponibilizaremos para vocês, tá bom? No YouTube, eu gostaria de agradecer o Gustavo, que está lá também nos ajudando com essa tradução. Então, seja bem-vindo, professor Dick. Welcome. É um privilégio ter você como palestrante do Integra EAD 2020. Welcome, Dick. It's your turn now. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. I'll be speaking about empowering citizens to develop mobile apps and towards a creative play pedagogy. And what I will do is to start by just giving you a little bit of a background as to what this whole problem is about and how we have decided to approach this particular problem. I am based at the University of Cape Town, and as you can be able to see, Cape Town is at the very bottom of South Africa. And what we also do see on this image is just to give you an idea of the city of Cape Town. And right in the top right-hand corner is the University of Cape Town. And this is where I am based. And as you would all appreciate, that because of COVID-19, we have all had to stay at home and work from home. Now, this is a very general case for all the places around the world where COVID has forced people, both students and lecturers and teachers, to stay at home and work from home. Now, one of the things that have happened as a result of working and staying at home is that there are certain applications or certain apps that have become very prominent in their use. For example, that because of stay at home and working from home, we have seen an increase in the use of virtual platforms. in this case, such as Zoom and WhatsApp. Although WhatsApp has been used by a number of people already before COVID, we have seen a good and high dependency on WhatsApp, and communications and meetings have been supported by different virtual learning platforms, including Zoom and you name them. There are quite a number of them, but I want to give you an example of some of the apps that have become prominent as a result of COVID-19. We have seen that online shopping to do with groceries have taken a huge lift, and we have seen that the doing of homework and different applications which would support students to study at home or support their home learning has also become quite they've been increased in their use. Like in here, I actually see show an example of photomats as an app. We also see for those that are in business, they are depending on reading the different stock exchange results and things like that using different kinds of apps. We actually see that the lockdown, the COVID-19, while we have stayed at home and to work from home, there has been an increase in the dependence on the use of mobile apps of different types to support the different activities. What we also therefore begin to see is that we need to be able to look at what is happening on a global scale and at national level as well. Now, in South Africa, there are 59 million people in terms of the population. We also then begin to see that there are also 22 million South Africans who own smartphones. We have, now, if you just look at the number of people with smartphones, which is quite high if you think about it, and that when you look at on a Google platform, on a Google Play Store, there are a total of about 2.7 million apps available on the Google Play Store, and 2.2 million apps are available on the Apple Store. Now, one of the things that one begins to see about this availability of the so many apps, where these apps have been designed and developed, they have all been focused on solving particular problems that have led to the design and development of these apps. And when you look at the South African context, there are not so many people that are developing apps, although there's an increase in the use of smartphones and the ownership of smartphones. The apps that are used are not developed in South Africa, are not designed. Most apps, although there have been some apps that have been developed locally, but a number of apps that are available on Google Play Store and Apple Store are those apps that people begin to download and use, but they've got to be appropriated for their different tasks because they are not specifically designed to address the problems that many people are actually facing or they would want to have resolved. Now, it is because of that, and to just reinforce that, we are dealing with the South African. For most of you, I expect you to know the background and the history of South Africa. And this article in the Times, in the Times magazine, which captured a very useful divide. If you see this image here, there is a road in the middle there, and you can see on the left-hand side, it represents a society who are well off, at least in the suburbs. In other words, so on one hand, you have people that are relatively middle class and living relatively well off. On the right-hand side, we actually see societies and communities of poor people, or at least people who don't have the kind of resources as we see on the left-hand side. And we actually, this image here, it captures and represents very well the kind of unequal nature of the society and equal nature of what we see in South Africa. Now, what this means really is that the kind of people that live on the left-hand side, the apps that they need, the needs that they have, are completely different from the needs and the apps that would be required by people who live on the right-hand side. And you actually see that for a world with the kind of divides in terms of the unequal nature of the society and communities, it actually makes a lot of sense that we begin looking at how do we ensure that we can empower different communities to develop apps that are appropriate for their relevant communities and for the challenges that they face in their respective communities. And this is what this thing is going to be about, and this is what I'm actually looking at in terms of this particular presentation. The other thing that you begin to see is that the Department of Basic Education in South Africa have introduced a new subject called coding from primary schools, and it should be able to then be taken up in high schools. Now, what has happened with the Department of Basic Education is that the reason why coding has been introduced in schools is to equip young people with skills that are needed for the fourth industrial revolution. And that is one of the arguments that have been put forward to ensure that coding can actually be taught to schools and prepare these young people, these learners, for the fourth industrial revolution. Now, we know that for coding to be introduced in schools, one presupposes that teachers have been prepared in coding, but that is not necessarily the case. We have pre-service colleges or universities that prepare these teachers to go and teach, who are not being taught coding in their preparation to become teachers. And in-service teachers have not necessarily been trained in coding. So the question is, how do you then introduce and support and ensure success of a coding subject without necessarily thinking about how do you ensure that you can introduce coding and support the fourth industrial revolution in a holistic kind of way? We need to be able to find effective ways of doing that. And I'll come back to this point because it is quite important when we think about the fourth industrial revolution and the skills that are required, because this is suggested here that coding is required for the fourth industrial revolution. However, when you look at the works of Butler Adam in 2018, published an article where Butler argues that the fourth industrial revolution requires more skills than coding. In other words, coding is not the only thing that is required. We need problem solvers. We need people who are capable of implementing and also managing and working with new technologies and working collaboratively. Now, so coding, if we are going to ensure that we can prepare young people for the fourth industrial revolution, then we must be thinking in terms of creating and fostering problem solvers, creating more problem solvers. And that is one of the things that becomes quite useful here. Having said that, when one looks at the concept, the notion of citizen developers, the whole idea of citizen developers, these are people who are highly creative, they are driven problem solvers, they have little or no prior knowledge of coding or app development skills, and they use rapid application development platforms to create fairly advanced applications. Now, so when one thinks about citizen developers, they're actually talking about people who are highly creative and they've got a mind to solve problems. And that is what you actually need. And I would therefore want to argue that the need for citizen developers is much more required if we are to prepare a generation or young people in terms of getting them ready for the fourth industrial revolution. So citizen developers is what we need. We need creative people. We need to have problem solvers who understand tools and technologies, and they can actually make the most of the apps that, the platforms that they can be able to use to create applications very quickly. Now, if one looks at Gartner, in 2019, they produced this this priority matrix for education for 2019. I want you to just have a look at what is projected for less than 2 years and which is said to be high, as opposed to the low and moderate and high and transformational. You see that citizen developers are ranked high in terms of less than 2 years of penetration, in terms of the adoption and that the phenomenon and the concept of citizen developers is seen to be an important phenomenon, an important notion to prepare people for where we are going, where we are going in terms of technological innovations. If you think about the way mobile phones have been appropriated in societies, one does not need to have gone to school to use mobile phones. We see people that are literate, illiterate, and from every kind of field using mobile phones. They understand how to use mobile phones. And we also see how that the use of mobile phones have been adopted and accepted for use in different fields. We see farmers using mobile phones, fishermen, we see marketeers, we see taxi drivers and taxi conductors or owners. They use mobile phones. Mobile phones are being used in different societies, in different communities. And it makes sense, therefore, that people that use mobile phones in these different societies and communities be the ones empowered to develop apps that are appropriate for them and appropriate for their context. And that is what citizen developers is really about. If you look at the hype cycle, which was last year's hype cycle, you also see that if the hype cycle, the purpose of hype cycle is to help us see how the technology moves from the innovation trigger, from the time the innovation is mentioned or comes onto the market. It goes through what is called the innovation trigger phase. So there is a lot of expectations and a lot of talk about that technology. And the technology reaches what is called the peak of inflated expectations. That is when it reaches that peak, the top part there, where people begin to realize that maybe the expectations that they had of this technology is not indeed what it is turned out to be. So they begin to lower their expectations of the technology. So technologies then go through the trough of disillusionment. During this time, it is actually a phase where people begin to realize that maybe there were too much expectation placed on this innovation or on this particular technology. And we must be able to reduce that expectation. It goes through the trough of disillusionment. And during this time, some of the technologies, they die away there. They don't make it into the slope of enlightenment. But I want you to just notice here that through the trough of disillusionment and the slope of enlightenment, just the second part there, you see the citizen developers. That the citizen developers have gone through the innovation trigger, the peak of inflected expectations, and has just survived the trough of disillusionment, and it's going to enter the slope of enlightenment, and then it will make it into the plateau of productivity. So this actually begins to show us that the citizen developers notion is a very important notion, and we must be able to ensure that we can pay attention to that, because it is where the future actually does lie. I should also mention here that there are a lot of projections that most organizations who are the small scale, medium scale, and even some large scale organizations are drawing on, and they will be using citizen developers notion in the next 2-3 years. And we actually do project that the citizen developers is going to be where the future is, where you have people who do not have programming skills. They've not studied computer science. They've actually studied completely different areas, and sometimes they've not even studied at all, but they understand their practice, they understand their domain, they understand their field, they understand their workspace in a way, be it if they are farmers, they understand farming, they understand that well enough that one expects them to be able to develop apps that are appropriate for that kind of domain, that kind of area. That is what citizen developers is about. And I think that it is useful that when one looks at the developing world, the developing context, particularly in the Southern Hemisphere, all the developing contexts, we don't have resources to actually train and put and even acquire software developers to build apps for us, because we just can't afford that. We actually need people that understand the context to develop apps which are appropriate for them. Teachers are appropriate to develop teaching apps because they know pedagogy, they know how teaching is supposed to work, and they are therefore the well-placed people to develop apps for education. Having said that, let me just proceed. The other thing we see that in the theory of structuration, it states that human beings are unconscious of the social structures that inform their actions. When one is inserted in a particular domain, you actually become such knowledgeable of what you do that you become unconscious of the social structures that inform the actions that one takes. So people are highly creative and they are driven problem solvers. Those that do that, they become so unconscious of the reality. They become so unconscious that they are creative and become so unconscious that they are problem solvers. What citizen designers, developers would have to do, therefore, is to harness these people and get them to believe that they are creative and get them to believe that they are problem solvers and make the unconscious conscious, and then empower them with the tools that they need to become designers. Because within the design embodies the designer, the thinking of the designer. We actually see as well that the unintended consequences of any action, it forms what is referred to the acknowledged conditions of further action. What this means is that every time you do something, when one is a designer, and they don't even know that they are, if you empower them to build something, you are actually bringing the unconscious to become conscious. And by doing that, with that realization, they become reflective of their own experience, and that reflection causes them to improve on their own practice and become better at what they do. And that is what Giddens argues there, that we can move from unconscious to conscious through reflection, and the non-reflective feedback there is what you actually experience through seeing something that you were thinking about, and you play with it and you see it coming to life, and you consciously begin to realize that you can actually achieve that. Now, what the creative play pedagogy, what I did a few years ago was to think through how children play, and the creative play pedagogy is borrowed from the concept of sandpits that children use to play, to build structures at no cost in the sandpit. And what Piaget once said, that if you want to be creative, stay in part a child with the creativity and invention that characterizes children before they are deformed by adult society. What this means is that we can actually achieve creative thinking through play. And when we allow adults to engage in playful activities, they can realize that they can be able to create things that they never thought possible before. For citizen developers who are non-technical people, they're non-coders, the more they begin to create something and the more they begin to see life in what they are building, the more confident they become at it, and the more they are capable of improving that to become designers and developers of apps that one can be able to use to solve real-world problems. What I've done is I've created I founded the Sandpit for adults, and called it ETILAB, which is Education Technology Inquiry Lab at the University of Cape Town. And this lab, the purpose of the lab is to allow adults to play with different possibilities, like children in the sandpit, to create different technological solutions, including mobile apps, and using playful pedagogies. And this is effective, as you'll be able to see, of some of the things that we've managed to do. Some of the things here we see that I just want to very quickly highlight an extract from one of the participants at ETILAB with regards the designs of some of the mobile apps. And let me just read this very quickly. What stood out for me was a presentation by one of the groups about creating an environment which enables new moms that just returned to work to be able to have privacy and time to express milk for their newborn babies. A lot came to mind about this problem, and things like would it have been solved in other ways without involving technology? I'm thinking of an app for vegans, for example. I wouldn't bother myself about such an app because I am a meat eater. So the app for new mothers is made to also create an awareness about the rights that these mothers have, how the app can actually reach the intended audience. Let me just mention here that during the activity, during the sandpit activity, this mother had just returned to work, having come from maternity leave, and therefore what was predominant for this student or this participant was to develop an app to help the new mothers effectively. Now, what this example goes to show is that the mother as a participant was thinking about their own practice, their own application, an app that would address their needs. And once you solve the problem for these particular new mothers, who herself was a new mother, that app would then be used by a lot of other new mothers. And that is what the whole thing is, which is different from somebody who has never had this kind of experience to develop an app for new mothers. So that is why a new mother with this kind of experience was well placed to develop an app that are appropriate, which could then be used by a lot of other people. The other is the idea of empathy, because we believe that empathy is an important part of as a point of departure if one is going to develop anything to solve real life problems. And you actually see that any kind of problem solving apps, you cannot be able to solve a problem without understanding a learning or educational challenge at hand. It will be very difficult to come up with an appropriate solution or design if one doesn't understand it, if one doesn't empathize. The best people to empathize are people that have experienced the challenge, that live with the challenge. And those are the best people to come up with a solution. We see empathizing with their client groups before suggesting a solution that was useful. We actually see here that farmers are best placed to develop farming apps. Learners are best placed to develop learning apps. Teachers are best placed to develop pedagogical apps, teaching apps. That is what the bottom line is. Even if they are not currently teaching, but because they have taught before, they are well placed to develop teaching apps. Some of the things that we've actually done, we've developed some of the apps. We've used app platforms. There are a lot of app platforms. We've used different kinds of app platforms. Like here, we see an example of what we used at some of the sessions there. We used the Fliplet, which has got prefab components, and where we saw a number of these participants ending up creating mobile apps, workable mobile apps, which are actually reflective of their own context and their own communities, because they have actually thought through and they understand their context. We have also looked at some of the kind of other apps, the teach back apps developed by educators there. We see some of these. Remember, one of the things that you see here, you see playfulness. You see an example of developing an app for play, for fun, playfulness. And playfulness is the core part of ensuring that we can empower citizen developers to become mobile app developers and designers. People with no programming code, no programming experience, no coding experience, ending up developing apps like this, and apps like this, and you actually see that it does work and it is effective, and we actually need that in terms of ensuring that we can prepare citizen developers for where we are actually going, and in particular, the fourth industrial revolution. Let me just then outline the kind of steps for empowering citizens using the creative play approach. The step one, provide the client with an opportunity to talk about how they experience the challenge or the difficulty for which they are seeking a solution. It is important that we start by giving a client or a user an opportunity to just express themselves on how they're experiencing the challenge. And the best way to do this is to allow somebody who has been in the space, who have lived that experience, who have actually lived in that kind of community to listen to these to this challenge, because they would be well placed to empathize. Step 2, go and re-articulate what the client said as evidence of having listened. Remember, you don't just want to go through the emotions and pretend that you are listening. You listen, then you articulate what you have heard, so that the client can be able to tell you whether you listened correctly or whether you misunderstood something. The step 3 is to make necessary adjustments as you listen to the client again. So as you listen to the client giving you the kind of feedback, you can be able to ensure that you are updating your notes, you are listening and making those different corrections. Step 4, find an appropriate builder for apps without code that would best be used to prototype the app that the client is seeking. I've given examples of some of what we have used, and what you need is to ensure that you can find an appropriate builder. And there are quite a number of builders right now that one can be able to draw from in terms of citizen developers. Step 5, demonstrate the app to the client. In other words, don't just build something and just push it to your customers or to your client. Make sure that you can demonstrate that to your client or to a group of people that are experiencing that problem, and explain to the client what the app does and how it addresses the needs as specified. That is important, because then you're able to receive feedback and you can iterate. So it's a very iterative process. Step 6, do a final submission to the client and gauge their level of satisfaction, because their level of satisfaction helps you to ensure that you can find ways in which you can improve upon what you have just developed and designed. Just about a few years ago, I posted this tweet because it does capture some of the things that informs these iterative process. The more we find answers to questions we have, the more we have questions about answers we have found. Now, I said this because what happens is that there's never finality. We are always in a state of finding and improving on what we find. So what happens is that every time we have a challenge, we find a solution to the challenge, and we keep asking about how can we improve this challenge? How can we improve this? Because we need to be in a continuous state of improving what we create. In conclusion, you need to leverage citizen developers' lived experience and knowledge of the context or the problem. Empower citizen developers with empathy-driven design techniques. Unleash creativity through play, that is, use fun pedagogy. Use low to no-code app development platforms to build, test, learn, and improve quickly. While Butler Adam in 2018 observed that fourth industrial revolution requires more than coding skills, this paper concludes that we need more citizen developers. And I've just put together a book chapter on empathy-driven mobile app development without coding, a case of citizen developers, which is just about to be published in this book that you see here. And the book should be published just towards the end of this year. But I do make a case of everything that I've actually talked about here is in that chapter, and much more. So thank you very much. And this is about what I wanted to share with you, so I can be able to take questions.
Oh, Dick, very good presentation. And in the chat, there are a lot of questions. And since I was there in Cape Town, I went there, I think, 2 years ago. I'm not sure. But I was very impressed with your work, with your lab inside the university. And the things that you said, it's so important for us from education, like having empathy, collaboration, the things directly related to the reality, to bring the lived experience and the creativity. So I think it's fantastic. So let's start with the first question. Ana Rocha, I'm going to ask you 3 questions, and then I think you can answer, and then another block. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So Ana Rocha, she asked 2 things. The first thing is, do you believe that the ingenuity represented in the magazine shows the African reality? Remember that you showed the cover of the magazine in the slide?
Yes.
That was the vibe.
Yes.
So she asked if you believe that that ingenuity represented the African reality. The second question from Anna, again, some African countries implement public state politics to the use of technologies in benefit of people who are poor or who are lacking of resources. If you have this implementation of these politics, the public politics, specific for the poor people. And the third question is from Diane. Diane said that here in Brazil and in many places, the use of cell phone was seen as something bad and also as a teacher competitor. With the pandemic, it became for many the only device to access content, to communicate, to interact, to learn. And she wants to know, how is it seen by the teachers in Cape Town, South Africa? So that's the first block.
Thank you. Thank you for the questions. The first part of the question is that, does that represent the ethical reality in terms of the divide? Look, the divide that there is in terms of the unequal society in South Africa is real, because South Africa has got the background, the apartheid kind of background, which divided different communities according to the racial, along racial lines. And we actually see that that is still the reality in terms of the distribution of resources. So yes, that does actually confirm that it is still a reality. It does impact on that. The kind of politics to do with the poor people and the public and giving them resources. Look, this is useful, but remember, for this to be sustainable, you want to ensure that you can not only give people the kind of resources, but you need to equip them with what to do with those resources, so that the use of those resources can take them away from being dependent on whoever gave them the resources. If we don't do that, we create a certain kind of dependency syndrome, where we've seen projects where the kind of external funders, they've put in a center and installed different kinds of tools or technologies in there, But when the funding finishes and they take that or that goes, and everything just collapses. So we need to be able to ensure that there is sustainable approaches attached to that. Then
to safety, to teach them to fish. Yeah.
Yes, to teach them to fish.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, if you just give them the fish,
Yeah.
they are going to be dependent on whoever gave them the fish all the time. And that is going to become a problem.
Yeah.
In terms of cell phones being demonized, cell phones being seen as evil, and we have seen that it's not just in Brazil, it has been the case across Africa. South Africa has not been exempted from that. For a long time, cell phones, and in fact, there are still many schools that ban the use of mobile phones so that learners should not bring mobile phones to school. And so banning mobile phones, not allowing learners to bring their mobile phones to school, it has been the case. However, what we have also seen is that during the COVID-19 lockdown, we see those schools now wanting to use the mobile phones that learners have to reach them, saying that, no, we want to reach our learners using WhatsApp. WhatsApp is going to run on a mobile phone, but the mobile phone, you didn't want it at school. So if the mobile phone wasn't wanted at school, why would we want to use the mobile phone to reach the learners? And we see this during the COVID-19. So one of the challenges with that is that if we continue to ban the use of mobile phones, learners begin to see mobile phones as being evil, we deprive this generation the ability to become designers of apps, to designers of mobile phones, to designers, no, because they can't design something which you are demonizing. If you think this is evil, how are they going to work in that space? Because so that is one of the challenges we see. We need to remove that, because one of the things that we've seen that most parents, because parents did not grow up with the mobile phones, parents are just buying mobile phones for their children, which they themselves don't also know how to use, the parents. So the parents buy mobile phones, which they don't know how to use. They give them smartphones, the children, and then the teachers don't want the mobile phones. So the parents don't know how to use the mobile phones. Teachers don't want the learners to bring the mobile phones. So the young people, they have the technology, the smartphone, which adults don't want. Parents want them, but don't understand them. Teachers don't want the mobile phones. So learners, young people, are teaching each other. And we should not be surprised that the mobile phones, so powerful, but it's not being used appropriately, because no one is there to teach these people, young people, how to use them creatively and properly.
Yeah, and we can't separate our lives from the university, from education. It's impossible to see that perspective. I can't understand it. Ana Rocha also asked, does matrix of education, represent the global reality? And Gustavo asked, because you mentioned about client, and he wants to know, why do you see the community as client? Because this term client in education is a little strange, isn't it? But he would like you to explain it a little bit more. Is it client really?
No, community is correct there, citizen developers and the use of community. The word client was used to describe a citizen developer developing apps for a community, for their community. So it's not necessarily planned in a business sense.
Okay.
Yeah.
And about the matrix of education, do you think that the matrix of education represents the global reality? Ana Rocha.
No. The matrix of education does not always represent the local reality. Does not always represent the local reality. The matrix of education is a snapshot of what is happening globally. And it is therefore a useful indicator of where we should, how we can place ourselves in terms of the local reality. So it doesn't always match the local reality, but it is a useful indicator of where things are at global level.
Yeah. I have a question.
Yes.
You showed a slide about Piaget, about the creativity.
Yes.
Staying part as a child. I like that very much, about the creative play pedagogy. And I'd like to know, how do your colleagues, the professors, your colleagues at the university, how do they see that? If they are jealous about that, because I'm sure your relation with your students, it's completely different from the rest of the university. So
it's very varied.
Yeah, and also, how do the community see that? The parents of the students, things like that. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
It's very varied. I would say it's varied because you see, if you get people that have never played at all, and you want them to play, because most adults, they think that play is only for children. So there is always that kind of strangeness, but they settle down to it. They do settle down to it when they begin to realize that, because the effective way for adults to learn is to remove the barriers that they need to get anything perfect. Adults tend to think that they should get everything perfect. When you allow them to realize that it's okay to fail, it's okay not to, for something not to work, it's okay. Most adults, it's strange because they haven't been, adults haven't been taught that. They haven't been taught that it's okay to fail, it's okay to just do something for play. And we have actually seen that adults take longer to settle down so that they can relax, so that they can have fun, so that they can learn without constraints, constraints of failure, constraints of just getting things perfect. But once they get to that, it is quite effective.
Yeah, very interesting, this way of seeing the mistakes. The mistakes are, we have to change the idea that mistakes are bad things, and they help us to reconstruct, rebuild, rethink. It's wonderful. Thank you. Unfortunately, we have to finish because the time, but it was wonderful to have you here. Thank you very much for being here with us. And the people in the chat, they are saying that you were great, they loved your presentation. And I also would like to thank Thais and Gustavo that they are in the chat translating the things.
Yeah.
And I hope when we finish this pandemia, you can come face-to-face to Brazil and we can meet again.
Yes, that's right. That would be a pleasure. Okay, thank you so much. And thank you to you, and thank you to the listeners and the audience there. So thank you so much. It has been a pleasure.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Bye. Bye. Bye.